Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? I trust your day's going well. It's a beautiful Sunday. Of course, every Sunday is a beautiful day. In reality, every day is a beautiful day, simply because it means we're still here. Anyway, I want to invite you to this Sunday morning service. I hope you're ready. Again, we're meeting from home, so go get yourself your breakfast. Go get your coffee, what it is you're drinking. I'm going to have a little bit of my bubbly water, and then we'll get started. You could get addicted to this stuff. This is Kirkland brand, so it's very cheap. But you can get addicted to this stuff. And I don't know. Anyway, I should probably just go to regular water. Anyway, here we go. I would have more coffee, but if I did that, I would have the propensity to talk fast. As you know, I have that anyway. That's why at church on Sunday mornings, when we're in our auditorium, I actually sit on a stool. People wonder sometimes why I do that, because if I do that, it tends to slow me down and I talk slower because I'm about 4 sentences ahead of what it is that I'm saying. Anyway, we have a lot to cover today, some good and some bad to some extent. But I'm trusting that we'll end up for the glory of God as we talk about some of the things going on in our nation this week. With that said, I want to talk about where we're going with church going forward from today. The county health department has still not released us to go back to services. So we're not going to be able to do that until they do. That might be this Sunday. I don't know. In light of the rioting that's going on in downtown San Jose, I don't know if they're feeling a little bit more jittery about it, and the fact that maybe with the COVID-19 virus, there could be a spike. So we don't know yet. We're going to just have to play it by ear. When we do come back to service, I'm working with those key components of people that we need to work with, worship team, how we're going to handle the ushers, the greeters, the offering, all of the different things. So we make sure that everybody's safe. Also, we bought the best chemicals we can to disinfect the areas that we're going to use at the church. And we'll continue to disinfect as we go along so that we all feel safe. And we're going to do the best we can when we do come back. So I just want you to know that. Might have to be patient for a little while, and I understand that as well as you. And so we're just going to have to go with it for a while. And you know what? Patience isn't a bad thing. And actually, this is a good time for us to seize the season and to use this time as a time to grow. I know many of you are back to work. A lot of us aren't. But it's a time to reflect. It's a time to pray. It's a time to think about God, people, and what truly is important in all of our lives. Anyway, that's part of it as well. The other thing is that Penny wants to announce that the women are going to be having on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock a Zoom meeting. And if you want to be a part of that Zoom meeting because you're not back to work yet, you can email Penny, and I'll have her email address down here on the bottom once I edit this so that you'll be able to see that. Also, she wants to do, for those of you that are working, ladies that are working, she wants to do a Zoom meeting on Thursday night. She just kind of wants to know what time works the best for you and how many of you would be interested in doing that. I know there's a lot of you women that have met on Thursday nights in the past, and I've always gotten great results out of that and spent some good quality time together. So this is a way for you to be able to do that. Lastly, see, that's how I get talking ahead of myself too fast. Lastly, men, we will be meeting this Monday night at 6:30, our regular scheduled time on Zoom. So if there's any men out there that want to be a part of our Zoom meeting, you can go ahead and email me and I'll make sure I include you on the email. Last time we had about 6 or 7. Last week we were supposed to have one, but we didn't because it was Memorial Day. I spaced it on Memorial Day last week, and I'm sorry that I did that because I would want to give a shout out to all of our veterans that have given themselves for our country. So I'm doing that today. I'm giving you a shout out. Happy belated Memorial Day, and we wish you and your family the best during this time. Okay, lastly, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but I will. My son says, Dad, why do you talk about finances? I said, well, it's our Sunday morning church service. I've got to talk about it. So I just want to let you know where we are financially, and you know as a Christian what your spiritual obligation is. And I think that all of us at the Father's house are mature enough to know what to do when it comes to our finances. So we're asking you to be gracious and to give, not just here, but wherever. And so that we can, as we go through this transition time, we can make it through with the best possible results for a church. Because after this shelter in place thing is done, we still have to go back to church as normal. And a lot of those bills, as you know, they just don't go away, and they won't go away. Anyway, that's just some things to be thinking about during this time of offering. So if you would give, it'd be greatly appreciated. You can really give in three ways. You can give either online by going to thefathershouse.org, and there's a give button up in the right-hand side. Or you can give by check, and you can mail that to 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you want us to stop by and pick up a check if you're in the area because you ran out of stamps, or you just want to see us, we promise to stay socially distant, but at the same time, we would come by and stop by and pick that up and say hi to you if you want to give it that way. So I just want to say once again, we appreciate, the Father's House appreciates how it is that we all work together collectively during this time and this season. So anyway, if you can give, it would be greatly appreciated. On another note, something that just came to mind is for some of you in the congregation that haven't reached out and touched anybody of your friends in a while, because we live this life of seclusion now, it might be a good time for you just to dial up a friend you haven't talked with in a while, make sure they're doing okay, and let's just kind of stay in contact with one another as a part of the beloved community, reaching out to one another as well. I think the strength of any community is not the pastor does it, or the pastoral leadership does it, but the strength is when the body does it because of our strength of who we are and our relationships that we have by way of our community. And the Father's House is a strong, strong community, and we've always built our church off of this idea of community. So if you can do that, it would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about that. But I want to go on and talk about a little bit, spend some time thinking together about kind of what's going on in our world today. And it kind of fits into this series that I've been doing recently called Build My Life, or those solid virtues of which we build our life off of. We took it off 2 weeks ago and we talked about the virtues of faith and hope. Last week we talked about prudence or practical wisdom. And today we're going to talk about temperance, which is also the idea of self-control, or the idea of having control over your own spirit is a better way to talk about it, think about it. But I want to bring a couple of other virtues into play today in light of the fact of what's been going on in our nation with this George Floyd incident where he was killed by a black man was killed by a white police officer. And it appears to be, and it is, or he has been charged with third-degree murder, which is manslaughter. Hard times. That's very, very hard to think about this. As a pastor, I thought that it needed to be addressed and that there were several things that I wanted to do to address this. And I was talking with Pastor Mario. As you know, he will be live streaming in Spanish through the Father's House website, Facebook page. At the same time, we are here a little bit later than me, but virtually right now. And we were talking about it, and he virtually came up with the same impressions in his spirit that were really, we believe, were the Holy Spirit on some things that we wanted to talk about in light of this event. I am agitated, as I'm sure that most Americans are, frustrated that our society is what it is, and a little on edge. So I can understand what's going on in our society at large, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that because our society has been living on the edge for a long time. And I want to tell you that I'm blaming our government and I'm blaming our media for that. And I'm not making any bones about that. I think that whenever the media cites one group against another group, and it causes agitation, we're just constantly living in this state of agitation. And I blame them all for this because our politicians ought to know better than to engage in that if they are truly politicians and they're true leaders, and our media ought to be held to a higher standard than that. With that said, I think there's some issues that we've got to talk about as the Father's House and at large as Christians. I don't think as Christians We have the luxury of sitting back and not addressing this today. Not just today as far as with Mr. Floyd, but every time it happens, whenever injustice happens, whenever violence happens, whenever, I guess, just unjust things happen. I don't think we have the luxury, nor do I think that God has not called us to anything other than to speak out against injustice, wherever we find it. With that said, I kind of want to talk about, in light of this Build My Life series that we've been doing, I want us to think about 4 virtues that are bedrock for a society to be built on, and also that you can find in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and you can find in the New Testament. It would be the principles of, first of all, justice. The second one, prudence, which we talked about last week, which is practical wisdom. The third one would be temperance, or the idea of controlling your own spirit. And the fourth one would be courage. Those 4 virtues are virtues, and there's several more, but those are probably, as Plato would say in Plato's Republic, he would see that those were the 4 virtues that any righteous, perfect society would be built on. So I want to talk about that in light of what's happening with the George Floyd incident. As you know, that there's been many riots going on, and we've had them in our town and around the Bay Area, and they've been really nationwide because, again, kind of going back to what the media has done, is they've set us on edge. And so we live with this angst, really. But justice is an interesting thing, because justice basically means that we have everybody's best interest in mind, not just the people that are in power. Justice would be the idea of, as Plato would say, it should be advantageous for the people and not advantageous for the rulers, for the leaders. That justice is something that is the fabric by which society is built on, and when unjust acts happen, a healthy society needs to respond to those things quickly, fairly, or justly. So justice is the idea of doing what's right, of making sure and ensuring that people are treated fairly and rightly, or justly. Kind of abstract words, I understand. So the idea of justice would be the idea of police power, which we saw with Mr. Floyd. The fact of the matter is those 4 cops, all of them that were there, the 3 that were on him and the one that was holding back the crowd, they all had police power. They had the power to arrest. They have the power to pull over. They have the power to give a ticket. They have the power to put you in jail. And they have this police power that's been given to them by the government. But just because you have the power doesn't mean you have to enforce the power with brute strength, with violence, with being mighty. As a matter of fact, true power comes in understanding the police power that you have when you realize that you have it there when you need it, but you use it only when you have to, and it's the last resort. You don't put a man down on the ground and you can see that he's not even resisting and keep your knee on his neck for that long and think that that's not the misuse of power and the misuse of the power and authority that you've been given to become just for all the people, not just for the people in power. That would be called an injustice, or being unjust. It would be when you use that authority that you've been given for your own advantage. It's the idea of a politician getting into office and taking bribes for a certain group. When a politician comes into office, they should care for all the people, not just a special group of people. They should be people that see society as a whole and want to represent them as a whole for the best of all in the society. That's justice. The second one I want to talk about, and we've talked about that for a while, is the idea of prudence. Weird word. We don't use that word prudence often, or the word temperance. We really kind of, our modern term for prudence, we talked about last week, would be common sense. Just simple common sense. The idea that if you keep your knee on a man's neck for 10 minutes, common sense tells you you're probably going to kill him. So I don't think you need to do that. I don't know if you guys have seen the video, but you can see it on YouTube, the complete entire 10 minutes. And we'll talk about that when we get to temperance, but the idea there is wisdom tells you that you ought not to be acting like that. So we have in our society the idea of this event of what justice is. And the reason that I think that our society is so outraged and we have the rioting going on is because we feel like justice isn't served the way it should be served all the time. In saying that, in the case here of the loss of our brother and a beautiful, beautiful man, Mr. Floyd, I think we all have to keep in mind that justice takes a while. This isn't going to be rectified in 2 weeks. We're going to have to go through the court system. And justice sometimes is, they talk about the scales of justice or the wheels of justice grinding slowly. Anyway, just kind of thinking about that and coming to the idea of practical common sense wisdom. And the third one I want to talk a little bit more about today is the idea of temperance, or the idea of a person controlling their spirit, if you would have. About the idea of ruling your own self, ruling your own spirit. So there's a text here in the book of Proverbs, again, a book of wisdom. And I just think that I've just kind of come to the understanding that in the last, I don't know, since we've been sheltering in place, and all I've been talking about with wisdom, that I think I've found that it's probably been God that we've been talking about this. I often sometimes wonder, well, I'm not teaching the New Testament. We're not talking about Jesus. We're doing some things differently. But I'm kind of understanding that we all need to be deeper spiritually. We need deep roots like an oak tree, not shallow roots like wheat or grass, if you would have it. So in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32, it says this concerning temperance, ruling over your own spirit. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. So the idea in that text is the idea of brute strength, and on the other side of it, this idea of ruling over your own spirit. And the psalmist is saying, Solomon here, the wise man, is saying that it's better to possess this notion of ruling over your own spirit than having this strength that you can use. I guess we could apply it to the Floyd situation when we say that probably the third thing there that really needs to be looked at is the idea is that he didn't really have control over his own spirit, but he relied on his authoritative might by way of police power. There's a negative way to look at these things. I understand that. But you can kind of see where it all kind of fits in. So if he would have been ruling over his own spirit, he would have realized that he didn't have to keep his knee on his neck, but he could have taken it off. And right now, Mr. Floyd would be alive. If you watch the tape, he's on the ground pleading for his life. There's people in the background saying, stop it, bro. You're killing him. You're going to cut off the circulation. You're going to kill him. And yet he kept it there. And so what happened was, maybe pride got there. Maybe he's burnt out. I don't know the reason, but at the end of the day, he didn't control himself. And control and have ruling over our own spirit is when we have ultimate control in life. Well, those are just issues that we're kind of looking at. But the fourth virtue that I want to talk about is the idea and this virtue of courage. The courage to do what's right. So in that video, there was another officer that they were saying, can't you do anything? Can you take care of it? And the other two officers that were there, with the one having his knee on the throat of Mr. Floyd. And simply the idea of they could have had the courage to say, stop it, slow down, get off of his neck. You don't need to be here in this position at this time. That didn't happen either, because they didn't have the courage to stand up to the injustice that was being done. I think that's why our nation is in such an uproar. I don't think that's all it is, but I think those are key components to what we're dealing with here. Justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance are all Christian virtues. They're all Jewish virtues. They're all American virtues, and in some ways, they're all humanity's virtues. So we need to see that as being a part of who we're supposed to become as Christians. You see, we build our life by being just people. We deepen our foundation by pursuing wisdom and becoming wise people. We develop ourselves to where we have influence with others when we rule over our own spirit and we're no longer carried away by our passions, by anger, by greed, by lust, by deceit, by what we want. But we simply have a fortitude within us that simply says, my passions no longer rule me, I rule my passions. Anger doesn't rule me anymore. The peace of God and the wisdom of God rules me. The last one would be courage. The idea that the Christian church, that us that name the name of Jesus Christ, that believe in God, and the idea that God wants justice for all, salvation for all, restoration for all, should be very vocal when injustice is done. I don't think we have the right to remain silent. For us to remain silent would be that we're not employing the virtue of courage. Now that gets sticky, I know, for us as Christians. It gets sticky because how is it that we speak out against injustice, and how is it that we protest without doing violence? And that's the point. Not looting, not tearing things up, not throwing bottles at police and having them throw tear gas back at us and thinking that's going to do any good, because wisdom would tell us that only leads to further violence. But I think that there's this issue that sometimes we ignore, and it's the idea of, well, Gandhi would call it ahisma. We find it true in Bonhoeffer. We find it true in Martin Luther King. We find it true in many, many different examples, and it's the idea of non-violent resistance. The idea that we would stand against injustice and resist it without becoming violent, even when people become violent towards us. As much as that's the part of what was done through the civil rights movement, or what Gandhi did in dealing with Great Britain, and we've seen lived out in other fronts and tied to Christianity, it's the idea of not getting out of control of our spirit with anger, but addressing the situation with wisdom, with speaking to the issue, of saying we're not going to stand for it. You can put me in jail. You can do whatever you want to do, but I protest what you're doing. And so I think that when we see that, and that when we do that, we find within us this virtue, courage, speaking out against the injustice. The thing that frustrates me the most in this, which is so racially charged, is the idea that me being white, I don't understand the black man's plight. I don't know what it feels like to be black in America every day. Not just occasionally, but every day living with racism. Now, you can say that racism doesn't exist. But if racism exists in one person, then racism does exist. But it exists in more than one. I've had an example or an experience I had once, I've never shared, of when I felt discriminated racially in a way that could have been violent. When I was a kid, I was about, I must have been 10 or 11 years old. We'd gone to a skating rink that we went to often, and I was a pretty good skater, roller skater. And so I went with a couple of friends of mine, and we met some other friends that were there, and we were skating around. And then there was this bus that showed up with these African-American young men and women that were a part of a summer program. And so they had gotten on a bus, and they had come, and they were skating at the roller skate rink. Well, they were not necessarily roller skaters per se, because they didn't have the opportunity to go to the skating rink as much as I did, because either their parents didn't take them, whatever the case might be. But I was a good roller skater. And so there was really, I think at that time, there were 6 of us white men, young boys, that were going around there skating fast, racing each other, doing what we did, because we were good skaters. I mean, well above average roller skaters. Well, we thought that we were the cream of the crop, and we thought we had it all. And here were these other African-American children with us there. And there was probably 30 or 40, maybe 50 of them there. Well, as time went on, some of my friends left, and there was only really, I think 3 of us, 2 of my friends and myself that were there. And one of my friends came up and said, we got to watch ourselves, because there's some guys over there that they want to beat us up. And so I look around, and there's some African-American young men over there that want to beat us up. And there's not just 1 or 2 of them, but there's 10, 15, or 20. I think it was because we agitated them by our arrogance. We agitated them by what we did. And I didn't see it at the time, but in me, it was this idea of white privilege. I know that people will say it doesn't exist. If you want to have this discussion with me, give me a phone call and I'll discuss the fact that white privilege does exist. And I wouldn't be very courageous or have the virtue of courage if, as a white man, I didn't say it's true. And I'm going to address that here just a little bit. So stay with me. Don't get too upset about it, but we're going to talk about it. So while I was there, it was this group, and they were going to get us. And for the first time in my life, I felt a fear come over me of the fact that here I was, a white man in a black man's world. And the fear that came over me, and the reservedness that came over me, and the oppression that came over me was real. So real that I vividly remember it in my spirit and in my mind today. That experience lasted about a half hour because they were getting on the bus to leave, and so nothing happened. If in my mind, I remember that experience that happened for about a half hour, imagine what it feels like if you're a person of color living in a white man's world all of your life. Everything that I felt in a half hour, they felt in their life. If that affected my mind in a half hour, how do you think it affects them? When we're walking down the street and we see some black men approaching us and we walk across the street. Now, you can say you have good reason to do that. But it's kind of interesting because in this COVID-19 thing that's going on, when we're out walking the streets, when you're walking down and you know that somebody's coming at you, either somebody goes out in the street or crosses the street, and you know what it would feel like. Put yourself if you were being racially treated, if you were what's called racial profiling, somebody saw a person of color coming at you and you cross the street, well, how would it make you feel? But what if you had to live this every day of your life? Not because of the COVID-19 virus, but because you were a person of color. How would it feel? What would that do to your mind? What would that do to your heart? What would that do to the way that you see our nation and people? I want to talk to my white brothers and sisters right now. And I know this is going to be very controversial, but I want you to think it through together with me. I can't speak for the African American community or anybody that are people of color because I'm not a person of color other than white. I'm not Hispanic. I'm not Asian. I'm not black. I'm white. And I know that within the whiteness of the community in which I live of whites, I know racism exists. I've seen it, I've heard it, and I've participated in it in my lifetime. That is true. I'm not proud of the fact that that's the way I was raised, the way I was brought up, or it's a part of our society as a white man. But it is. But what begins to change you is when you begin to change your mind about things. What begins to change you is when you understand that I can't speak as a black man for the black community, but I can speak into the white community and tell you that there's never been a time that our brothers and our sisters has needed our voice to stand in solidarity with them and realize that we cannot tolerate injustice anymore at any level, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. It's got to be proactive, but it's something we've got to do and stand up and say, enough is enough. Stop it. Stop the madness, and let's become a better people than this. Father's house, that's who we are. That's what we've built our community upon. We're a racially diverse church. The last time we talked about this, I think there's 13 different races that are all represented as a part of the Father's house, and we've learned to live together, seeing each other's color, respecting each other's color, and loving each other's color. The same thing we could say is true for gender. We've done the exact same thing with the LGBT community and our views there. The idea that everybody has this right to stand before God and to live their life in freedom. No matter who they are, no one has the right to take those things away from them. I know I'm going to go on a little bit long today, and I hope you bear with me, but I won't be much longer. I've often said that the way that you change a man is you change his library. I think the way that we change the white men and white women's community to see things differently is to change your library, to change what you read, to get a different perspective. I know this is hard to hear. And I'm saying it gently but passionately. And I'm asking you to just hear me out here, to think about it deeper and longer than you ever have. But I think that comes by changing your library. And I want to ask you if you would start to think about reading some literature that I want to suggest to you. Because then maybe you see something different. You catch it from a different perspective. History is always told by the victor, not the victim. But the victim still has something to say about history. The slaves in America still have something to say about historically what they lived, even though they weren't the victors, or they were the oppressed. The oppressed still have a story. And maybe when we listen to the oppressed story, we'll hear a new reality. We'll have a changing of the mind. So I want to suggest a couple of books that maybe you could read. Some of them I've suggested in the past. But I just want to share them with you here for a moment. Not just for the white community, but I would think for all of us at the Father's house. Every one of us, these would be good books for us to read, talk about, and think about together. This first book is called The Person and the Common Good by Jacques Maritain. This is a book that really deals with capitalism and Marxism thought and the kingdom of God. And what it really focuses in on is the idea that every person has the right to stand before God, no matter who they are, because God created them. And society ought to point people towards that rather than trying to keep them away from God. In other words, it's the idea of every single person is important. Very good book. This really has to do with political science. It has to do with sociology, anthropological studies. It's really kind of a book. He uses St. Thomas of Aquinas, and it's really philosophical and theological, but probably more philosophy. The second book is called The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. This book is a great book to read because what he does in this is he deals with a Christian philosophy or theology, and what he does is he juxtaposes, or I guess he says, or what he does, he says that the lynching tree is the modern day cross that Jesus Christ died on. And so what you have is you have the African American struggle, and he talks about lynchings that have happened and the way that they've basically gone forward through history, even after, well, the civil rights movement and kind of even the idea of the lynching tree is not now just people hanging off of trees, but it can be. But isn't what happened in Minnesota or Minneapolis, isn't that something that's somewhat similar to a lynching tree? So this book talks about it from the Black perspective. It would be called Black Liberation Theology. It would be a great, great read. And I guarantee you that this book is not difficult to read. The Maritain book is going to be much more difficult to read. This would be a great one. A next book would be called Faith and Violence by a man by the name of Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton is a Cistercian monk. And he's dead now. He died in 1968. He was electrocuted. But he wrote this book about faith and violence and the idea that as Christians, we shouldn't give ourselves to violence in the way of violent resistance. And so he's a proponent of nonviolent resistance. So the idea that we can protest, but we don't have to become violent, but we still protest. Great book if you guys want to read that. Another one is a book that I've recommended and that some of us have read here. And it's basically called The Beloved Community, How Faith Shapes Social Justice from the Civil Rights Movement to Today by Charles Marsh. And this is a book about the beloved community that we really base the Father's house off of. The idea of equality for all people, about us caring for one another. It's not about having a power structure in our church of those that are in authority, the master-slave relationship, but it's about community. Another good book, but it also talks in here about the civil rights movement and the African Americans' plight from their perspective, not from the whites' perspective. The last book that I think is a great book, and it's called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And this was I want to say it was a national bestseller. This book talks about the migration of the African American population after with the abolition of slavery. So it talks about the migration of where they went, going to Detroit, ending up in Oakland, how they got there, and the fact that they still live in poverty and that those things haven't really been addressed. So it really gives you kind of a great perspective on the African Americans' plight. Now, I know that most of this has to do with the African American community, but I think we also need to keep in mind the Latin American community that's come here, or the Native American community that has lived here, in a predominantly now kind of a white governed society. Most of our politicians are white, at least at the top level. So it just gives you a new perspective to think about. I was walking earlier with my wife and I was talking about a book by Martin Luther King that he wrote, which would be another one I would recommend. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's called The Strength to Love. Now, I don't know when I read the book if this is in the preface or a part of it, but the title caught me, The Strength to Love. And I thought about that in the Black community's fight for equality. And it's the idea of, God, give me the strength to love people that I could so easily hate. And I could so easily hate them because of what they've done to me. But God, give me the strength to love them. If that community is reaching out for that, do we have the strength to embrace them and to invite them in? Father's house, I'm hoping you say yes. To my white brothers and sisters, I'm asking you to think differently on these matters. I'm asking you to drop your smugness, your arrogance, your white privilege, and realize that there's people out there that don't have what we have. And I know you may not believe it, but if you've been to some of the places that I've been and seen some of the things that I've seen, you would know it exists. And if any of you don't believe that to be the case, call me, come with me, and we'll go into these communities and you can see how poverty has paralyzed the people of color in our nation. What are our nation's three biggest sins? Racism, poverty, and a third one. I forget what it is. Racism, poverty, say it, Penny? Slavery. And slavery. And I know you don't think that those things exist, slavery maybe, but I challenge you. I flat out challenge you. If you want to see it, you can. But more than that, I want to challenge you to do something about it. Because for me to do any less would be less than a Christian. I know this has been a very direct message. I hope it makes you think. Because this whole thing's made me think. Thank you. Father, I just thank you for this day. I ask that you would put in our hearts and in our spirit the wisdom and the temperance, sense of justice, and the courage to be members of the Father's house and the Christian body, to speak out and to be a light in these times, and to protest wherever we find injustice. Lord, I thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, God bless you, Father's house. I know this has been a direct message. I hope that you get something out of it from my heart, my spirit. is so stirred and so hurting for Floyd, his family, and our nation. God bless you. I hope you have a great week, and thanks for hearing me out.